Hello everyone, and welcome to this next video in mine and Mr Messenger's series of videos exploring the power and conflict poems that you're studying for your English Literature GCSE. This next video will be focusing on Ted Hughes' poem Bayonet Charge, and we'll start off by discussing some of the representational and contextual issues so that you have a framework for you to focus your closer and more precise comments on. And we'll start off with a brief mention of Ted Hughes and his family, because Hughes himself did not experience conflict in the First World War. He was too young. He was born 1930. It was his father who served on the front line. And although Hughes is known as a poet of nature and the natural world, he also had a keen interest in military conflict, and in particular the experience of soldiers in World War I. And there's no question that he would have seen and had to deal with the long-lasting impact and the psychological trauma caused by serving on the front line in the military. And that would have focused completely around his father and his experiences his father had as well. So Hughes, whilst not having that direct experience of the front line, would have heard about it. And that perhaps gives him a more contemplative perspective, which we'll come to look at in a moment. I mentioned a moment ago that Hughes is a poet who focuses on nature, but he takes a particular perspective, and he often looks at the balance between the brutality and the beauty of nature in equal measure, and the way man interacts with nature. And it's that balance between the harsh and the light, the brutality and the beauty, that Hughes comes back to again and again and again in his poetry as a whole. And it should come as no surprise to you that this poem does much the same thing. You have these shot-slashed furrows against some of the celestial imagery that he uses in his poem, for instance. And he also has a genuine interest in astrology and an interest in the stars and celestial imagery, and that comes up again and again and again in his poetry, and it almost becomes a sort of demi-faith and religious system for him. And I mentioned a moment ago the quotation, the shot-slashed furrows, and Hughes also has an agricultural background, and again in this poem it should be no surprise that some agricultural farming images briefly turn up as well. But when we think about this poem, and this poem in particular, yet alone Hughes's broader interests and the things he focuses on in his poetry, this is a poet that explores the place of a soldier within conflict. But that place of the soldier is physical and it's political. And this poem has that double dimension, the physical experience of serving on the front line and the political experience of serving on the front line. The way in which jingoistic beliefs, nationalistic beliefs, can be thrown aside in an instant because of the harsh need and the immediate need just to survive. And then that throws up that mental, psychological element to this poem as well, which gives it its contemplative edge as well. That even in amidst the chaos, there is still time for contemplation that Hughes ekes out. And finally, a final contextual idea is that Hughes has a strong belief in English as a powerful language for poetry. Traditionally, in centuries past, French or Latin was considered the dominant languages for poetry because of their rhyming words. French and Italian rhyme really easily, and whereas English has fewer rhyming opportunities. And what Hughes does instead is he focuses on the sound patterns, the phonetics of his poetry. And you often find in his poems that there are many sound patterns, lots of sibilants and plosives and dental sounds that add to the tone and the quality and the textures of these poems. And this, again, is no exception. And Hughes believes that English is a language that is just as powerful and just as effective as French and Italian and Latin. And this is a wonderful example of a poem where he uses the full power of the English language to great effect. And we will look closely at a few examples where he does this. So that should give you a framework with which to look at this poem. And now we'll look at the poem in some close detail so that you can develop a range of interpretations and explore how a range of meaning is produced as well. Okay, so beginning with the first line of this poem, suddenly he awoke and was running. We start in what's called in media res, which it means in the middle of the action. This is a very sudden, abrupt, almost overwhelming start, throwing us right into the middle of an unknown situation. If we didn't have the title of the poem, Bayonet Charge, we wouldn't know that we were in the middle of a battle. But we do have that title. We do have that title, Bayonet Charge, and we have therefore the immediacy and the horror of potential close armed conflict. Not shooting from a distance, but being close enough to see the person that you're killing, close enough to be able to thrust your weapon and the bayonet into the chest and stomach of the opposition. You have then, because we start in media res with that adverb suddenly, the immediacy and the horror of being thrown into battle. There is here, it's almost dreamlike or nightmarish. It's certainly surreal and perhaps gives us a sense of being detached from reality, which may be Hughes commenting that war is a detachment from reality and conflict is a detachment from reality. And we talked about in the introduction about the importance of sound patterns to Hughes. Words like suddenly, with that harsh S sound, the raw seamed hot khaki and his sweat heavy, those sibilant sounds have this intensity to them that adds to that experience. But within that word clods, which just means lumps of earth, you have the guttural C and the dental D. They're harsh, heavy sounds. And always remembering that sound patterns add qualities to a poem, never meaning themselves. So here, a harshness, a heaviness. It gives a weight to what the soldier is moving through, as though they're being weighed down, as though they're being limited in some way. And, I've mentioned those sibilant S's, the suddenly and stumbling. These sibilant sounds have an uncontrolled suddenness to them, as though their movements are uncontrolled and difficult to manage and regulate as well. So those are the first few lines of the poem. You might pick up on the raw seamed hot khaki as well. That rawness, harshness, and the khaki as well as raw seamed, harsh seamed, as though the equipment that they're wearing is rough and ready in some way. I bring you down onto this next line, this personification of bullets smacking the belly out of the air. Again, you'll notice Hughes' intense use of sound patterns. The plosive B sounds there are destructive, explosive sounds, mimicking the sound of bullets hitting their targets, hitting flesh, hitting the ground. And as the air is being smacked out, it's as though oxygen and life itself is being harmed and destroyed. After the dash, we move on to the simile. He lugged a rifle numb as a smashed arm. And here the sound patterns change. You get the lyrical L, the nasal N, and these are softer, gentler sounds, as well as that nasal M in smashed an arm, as though everything has gone senseless and sense has been stripped away. On top of that, this simile makes the weapon, the gun, the rifle seem as though it's become just an extension of his body that's been damaged and harmed, but potentially also made useless, as though the equipment provided to the soldiers is not good enough. But what's interesting here is the arm has been almost replaced by the rifle, as though the synthetic, the metal and the mechanical is replacing that which is natural. Hughes then takes us to the final two lines of this stanza, the patriotic tear that had brimmed in his eye, sweating like molten iron from the centre of his chest. Now this is mirrored later in the poem, and we're going to come back to that. But the idea of the patriotic tear, it's this older ideal, it's an older value. And patriotism, pride in your country, is an idealistic virtue in and of itself. The fact that it's a tear and it's brimming in his eye, it's almost as though it's bursting out of him in this uncontrolled way. But the line underneath, sweating like molten iron from the centre of his chest, undermines that immediately and seems to cut away at much of the positivity of it. If he's got this molten iron in the centre of his chest, it's again the natural human condition being mechanised, being made metal, having the humanity stripped away, the natural life being stripped away and replaced with this metallic centre instead. The fact that it's molten and hot suggests that perhaps that patriotism is out of control, has become overwhelming, but equally it's become damaging. Now, within the stanza, considering the structure of it, you can see me highlighting in blue the lineation. We have these dashes and commas acting as as caesura and enjambments, and there is an irregularity to this. Some lines are interrupted, some lines are not. Some lines carry on over with a dash. There's a broken hesitation here and an irregularity that suggests that the soldiers' experiences themselves are becoming exhausted and fractured. Now, as we move into the second stanza, and I mentioned earlier in the introduction Hughes' interest in astrology, and here we have in what cold clockwork of the stars of the nations was he the hand pointing that second. And we have that hesitation just before that line, but it's as though from the soldier's point of view, this poetic voice is seizing on that and it's being distracted by an astrological belief. We're talking about the stars, and stars signal fate, and traditionally signal fate, that your fate is aligned and inevitable. But instead, those stars are turned into a cold clockwork. So again, the natural, and the eternal in this case, has been made mechanical. And it's as though the natural order of the world, the natural order of the universe has been disrupted and interrupted. And it's framed as a question as well, as though the outcome has been made uncertain. And it certainly places the position of the soldier as one who has no control and is utterly powerless. In that sense, reflecting the powerlessness of the infantry, particularly in the First World War, where, when they charged as a soldier with a bayonet, they would often be doing that as an act of sacrifice, and with no sense of outcome and no sense of strategic value. And there is that alignment there, finally, between the stars of the nations. It's almost as though the natural priorities in warfare have overwhelmed original notions of predestination, as though the natural order of fate has been overtaken as well, particularly in the theatre of war in the First World War, which is well known and regarded for its brutality and destructive harm. This is a line that people often don't comment on. I think it's worth highlighting. We have the simile, like a man who has jumped up in the dark. It's as though the soldiers are running blind. The cold clockwork of the stars knows which way the soldiers are going, but here the soldiers are shown to be running blind. They're unable to look past immediate threats, they're unable to see into the past or into the future or have any sense of control over that. So there is a blindness there. And we're pausing here and just really highlighting this hesitation, this pause. And we picked up on some of that hesitation in the first stanza in the lineation. And here we have the foot hung like statuary in a mid-stride. It's this pause and this hesitation that we're seeing. It's this moment of reflection and recognition of the brutality of war, the damage and destruction of war, and potentially allowing us to see maybe the pointlessness of the sacrifice. Now, as we come to the end of the second stanza, you can see it's enjambed into the third, and Hughes is highlighting at the end of this stanza, following two stanzas where the mechanical has replaced the natural and the organic, where the agricultural has been interrupted. The furrows, what farmers cut into the earth in order to tend and prepare the earth for planting seeds, crops, and things like that. Here, humans' natural action is to tend to the earth, to look after the earth, but it's being undone, it's being slashed. And it's a violent verb that we have there, as though that whole natural order has been absolutely interrupted. Hughes intensifies that through the enjambment into the third stanza, where we have that yellow hare who rolled like a flame and crawled in a threshing circle. So then the innocent figure of the hare has been harmed and has been damaged and is out of control. It's crawling, it's struggling. And I think Hughes is encouraging us to see the hare as a symbol and as a parallel for the soldiers that the soldiers are equally innocent, equally likely to be harmed, equally likely to be damaged, and equally unable to control the degree to which they have any influence over that. Very much like a hare has no control over human action, over human activity. We have that hare's mouth, and Hughes takes this further, its mouth wide, open, silent. Again, another interruption, as though life has been stripped out of that hare. In the same way, in parallel, life is being stripped out of the soldiers. As we move on into the next line, and where we plunged past with his bayonet towards the green hedge, the soldier doesn't have time to even stop and look at that, to really pay due attention to it. And Hughes gives us a poetic voice who allows us to see that parallel between the soldier and the hare. Maybe this soldier doesn't want to accept his own mortality, won't stop. And I think it's worth pointing on that word plunged, as though this soldier is sinking into death, sinking into his inevitable death, and having to face his inevitable mortality. And here I think is where Hughes is criticising jingoistic patriotic ideals. He lists king, honour, human dignity, and follows that with the colloquial etc., as though they are being completely rendered immaterial, rendered utterly pointless, rendered utterly redundant. Within this brutal warfare, old values, old traditions have lost their meaning. And Hughes is criticising the way in which old institutions, the monarchy, government and politics, were used as means to try and inspire. But Hughes is showing that actually in the theatre of the First World War, in this brutal conflict, these are luxuries that can be dropped. They are pointless, they are redundant. In the face of brutal warfare, they have no meaning and offer no ability for the soldiers to survive or find safety at all. And that leaves us with this final metaphor of his terror's touchy dynamite, as though, being terrified and afraid, there is this perpetual and constant threat. Now, I said we were going to come back to this idea of patriotism, and we can see here the movement from the start to the end of the poem. We start off with a patriotic tear brimming in his eye, and we explored the complexity and the problems of that, and we then see by the end of the poem where that finishes. It's been dropped like luxuries, it's been completely dismissed and thrown to one side. That's all from me looking at Bayonet Charge. You should go back to this poem, conduct close analysis, selecting 3 or 4 quotations, making sure you pick those features out, but picking up on some of the bigger, wider representational issues that we've discussed through this poem. Thank you very much, and good luck with your reading of this poem.